Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.
And a very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation today with a foreign policy analyst, but who's actually an analyst of various things, current affairs. He's, of course, none other than Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke. Very good evening to you, Mr. Wijetilleke, and thank you for being on the program.
Good evening, Faraz. Thank you very much. Once again, it's a great pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. The pleasure's all ours, actually. Now then, I thought I'd ask you this question. We'll come to these other matters as well. But, Kusum, is being economical with the truth a new form of economic policy?
Well, for us, I think the fact of the matter is that perceptions matter. And perceptions are gleaned from our past performance. And I think when you talk about economic policy today, what we are seeing is a bit of window dressing, in my humble opinion. I think the president's speech today talked about raising tax revenue as a percentage of GDP to previously 2019 levels. He talked about SOEs and restructuring SOEs and building up our dollar reserves through all these things. Now, I think specifically the dollar reserves brought up to the SOEs was also a policy of Mr. Cabral only, a matter of a year or so ago in his central bank roadmap. We all saw what happened to that roadmap as well. So I think it's been a tried and tested policy to be economical with the truth, but I don't know if it served us and our interests very well, for us, to be honest.
But it's to me, it's all indicative of a completely mismanaged, apart from the economy, a mismanaged management team, if you like, politically speaking. We have the president of our country, who's probably, in about a little over 80 days as the president. And he makes a speech in Parliament in which he tells Parliament, and Parliament, of course, being a representative of the people, and he says to them that Japan was very much for assisting us in this whole debt restructuring and all that. Not an hour later, not even an hour later, one of the most respected news organizations globally, Reuters, carry a story in which they say that an unnamed Japanese source who requested anonymity said that there was no such thing and that it was probably, or it may be, wishful thinking on the part of Sri Lanka. And thereafter, the PMD put out a statement which is more reflective of what now appears to be the factual position. It's been waste of time for everybody, including the public.
I wonder if I can take you back, for us, to the early days of the Yahapalne regime. And do you remember the Volkswagen factory, the assembly plant that was supposed to come up? So it's a similar sort of thing, isn't it?
It was called the Volkswagen factory.
That's right, the Volkswagen factory. So, I mean, let's just take a look at this particular government, because I think if we talk about the Gotabaya regime and the Pohottua-led parliament, which it still is, you could say that there are no reformers in that, and we can make all sorts of excuses. Mr. Wickremesinghe was brought in as president on a reform platform. That was what was suggested at the time. I have to say that that was an opportunity for him to really stamp his authority and say that we need to bring in professionals into Parliament. He could have pressured members of the ruling party to give up a few seats, at least bring in people who are financial experts, economic experts, negotiators, bring them into the field, put them on the cabinet. Let's have a good faith attempt at resolving our policy issues. Instead of that, we've seen more of the same, pretty much a very similar cabinet to what was there before. We've seen him putting his own loyalists into various positions, various committees. So I just think that this signals another lost opportunity. And on the other side, we've seen it's even been mentioned in the Human Rights Commission report regarding the suppression of protesters, and we've already have an image problem with the international community with regards the end of the war. We've now given ourselves a whole new image problem with the suppression of largely peaceful protesters. And that's happened under this president's watch, the one you wouldn't have expected to go down that authoritarian route.
And to compound matters, today is probably one of those days that this easily, 2022, will go down when historians write about it, as one of Sri Lanka's very own annus horribilis, because today the Foreign Minister of Sri Lanka, Mr. Ali Sabri, found out that he has this sort of a very good record of being the worst performing foreign minister in contemporary Sri Lankan history, in the sense that we were comprehensively voted against at Geneva with the United Nations there. And the voting at the end turned out to be 20 against Sri Lanka, 7 for, and 20 abstaining. Which
yeah, if I can just, before we discuss what happened at UNHRC, maybe give a disclaimer for your audience and just sort of accept. We fully acknowledge that there is a perception and even the accusation of double standards in this international arena.
Yes.
We know that there is a Western hegemony over some of these organizations, and I think it's fairly well traveled ground in terms of showing that there are motives, there are threats to sovereignty, there is the application of universal jurisdiction. So there are all these issues. Taking all that into consideration, we have to accept that we are in this international system. We have to engage with the international system, and we have to do so in good faith.
Indeed.
Now, Mr. Sabri's performance, I won't go into anything other than just what he said yesterday, which in itself, it showed a bit of inexperience, shall we. So he made the point that Sri Lanka has been on the agenda continuously since 2009. But he should surely have asked himself, why is that? Why have we not moved the needle? Why are they coming back with roughly the same resolution, with deeper conviction, with more rhetoric? He made even the bizarre notice about the peace dividend. He talked about how Sri Lankans enjoyed the peace dividend, and I have to say, during a period of historic economic strife, should you really be talking about a peace dividend that came 13 years ago, or 12 years ago? It seems a little bit facetious. And then he went on to, again, well-traveled ground about the 12,000 LTT cadres rehabilitated since the war. He made a dubious comment of 95% of land being returned to the Tamil people. You'd have to check the veracity of those comments. He mentioned pressure brought on the core group by diaspora groups. Again, something that's been spoken of before. It's not new, this pressure. So Sri Lanka has a huge foreign service. We can certainly push back on this better than we've been doing. And then he brought up the PTA and mentioned a few piecemeal amendments that they've made and more commitments about this counterterrorism bill that's going to replace the PTA. So for us, I just want to mention most of the flack we are getting from the international community is based on us not fulfilling the commitments that we have made. Mahinda Rajapaksa himself said in 2009 that we will look to implement the 13th Amendment.
That is mainly what the United Nations, basically the international community, are asking us to do. It is what we promised in the first place. And why on earth did he say it if he had no intention? Did he speak with a forked tongue on purpose? Or was it just to get out of that moment?
I think,
and he doesn't give a monkeys about anything else.
I think for us, the fact of the matter is that Sri Lankan leaders throughout, and I don't want to isolate anybody in particular, but all Sri Lankan leaders practice appeasement, right? Either we are appeasing our voters, we are appeasing our donors, or we are appeasing the international community. Now, it's one thing to appease, but you have to follow up. And 2009 to 2022 is an awfully long time.
Of course.
Right. Now, we've had certain movements. I don't want to say, again, rehabilitation we've done fairly well. We've done some resettlement work that has been very commendable. It's been commended by the international community. So they are commending us on things that we've done. But you take the Office of Missing Persons, for instance, and the Office of Reparations, they haven't moved anywhere near far enough. They were formed in 2017, 2018. So these are all commitments that we have to make. And I think what is reflected at the UNHRC is Sri Lanka's own lack of internal solidarity or a lack of an internal plan with how to move forward with the national question. It's always been about the national question, hasn't it?
And just to also compare this in terms of, now that's the international position, but if we go to the Kalutra district where the Gammadda team is, apart from being in Jaffna, Devani and Matale as well, on our door-to-door, the Gammadda movement's door-to-door campaign. In Kalutra, there's a school, just similar to what you're saying on the international scene, but locally, there's a school in the Kalutra district that has a computer lab, and our Gammadda movement's team had a look at it and was shocked to discover that it had no computers. And to make it worse, the children there didn't have, some children didn't have a lunch packet, a lunch to have. And the teachers there organized along with various donors, and they were lucky today they got a good meal thanks to a donor. And that's what I'm trying to say. And that is exactly reflective what you've said. Now these children, if no fault of their own, they find themselves, or their parents find themselves unable to feed these children. And thank goodness for the resilience and the proactiveness of the teachers there, that somehow they've managed to give them a meal, right? But that's not what the teachers ought to be doing. They ought to be giving these children a sound education, because they are, after all, our future. And what fun is it having? I think it's tantamount to torture to have a computer lab and then not have any computers.
Firas, I saw an article recently as well that discussed this. Basically, Sri Lanka, within our region, certainly I remember specifically within our region, we had some of the longest school closures throughout the pandemic. We've also had a historically low state investment in our education system compared to our income peers. So it seems we hear a lot of talk about Sri Lanka trying to develop human capital and innovate and all of that, but we're trying to do that without investing in our education system, without investing in our health system. And right now, in the midst of an economic crisis, the IMF are telling us, invest in education, invest in your health. And instead, the majority conversation, especially amongst the Colombo, shall we say the intelligentsia, is about reducing government expenditure. So in one sense, we'd have to say at least the president is at least speaking about the revenue side of the equation. But if he's talking about going back to 2019 levels, we are in a completely different world to 2019. If we are to make our way out of this recession, we have to grow our economy. Growing our economy is not easy when you already have inflation, when you already have unemployment. So
well, and that's the difference. In Sri Lanka, our president, whether we like it or not, he is the president. And he's been so for over 80 days. And in sharp contrast to, let's say, the British economy, where Prime Minister Liz Truss, in about, today would be exactly a month since she's been there. And yesterday she said, grow, grow, grow. In Sri Lanka, it's shrink, shrink, shrink. An economy of $80 billion is now about 65 billion. And the Prime Minister says that he wants to get the revenue, the tax revenue, up to 14% of GDP. Does he realize that this is a 23 trillion economy, and 14% of that is an awful lot of money? He's talking about actually collecting over 3 trillion rupees, when we're nowhere near that now. Is this another economic story like what Parliament was treated to about Japan earlier today?
Yeah, I think Dr. Harsha De Silva has also mentioned this in the media, that some of the plans seem fantastic and that we're not going to, it just seems unlikely that we're going to get anywhere near. You mentioned Liz Truss and her specific comments regarding grow, grow, grow,
yes,
or growth, growth, growth. She actually mirrored a campaign promise by Tony Blair in the late 90s, where he said the top 3 priorities for his government would be education, 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 which comes back to our conversation about what we have to do in Sri Lanka for the future. When you talk about tax as a percentage of GDP for us, in the 90s, Sri Lanka was on par with our income with our income peers. So we had about 20-25% of our GDP from tax revenue. Now, as a percentage of GDP, our tax revenue has fallen dramatically. It was 14.6% in 2006. In 2014, it was 10%. Went up slightly to 12% in 2015, and then 2019, 11.6%, and 2020, 8.1%, and it's been lower ever since. So I think if we are going to come out of this, we have to start understanding that Sri Lanka for development has to happen in two ways. Either you raise money through taxes or you raise money through borrowings. I don't think we can raise any more through borrowings.
No, we've lost all integrity there.
Yes, so I think the only way we can go about this is by increasing taxes further. And now, unfortunately, it's about trade-offs, isn't it? And it's about how much you can press people to make that trade-off. Now, is there industry pressure? I saw an article today about possible protection for rubber imports, something to protect the local rubber industry. Now, it's important to protect our local industries for us, but then we're also talking about liberalization on the other side. So how does that protectionism give in to these long-term economic policies about liberalization? So I think that these are there's a multitude of pressures that I just don't see the president even confronting, let alone negotiating.
And on that note, let's go for a quick break and take a peek at this evening's headline news from that wonderful News First primetime news team. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
UN Human Rights Resolution on Sri Lanka adopted. China, Pakistan support Sri Lanka, while India, Japan and Nepal abstain. Triple homicide in Minuangada linked to 2017 kite case. President extends invitation to join his journey.
මම නැවතත් ඔබේ නිල්ලා සිටින්නේ පැරණි කෝන්තර අමතක කර මේ ගමනට එක්වෙන ලෙසයි. වැටී තිබුණු රටක් යලි ගොඩනැංවීමේදී මහා විජිත රජු අනුගමනය කළ කරුණු කුටදන්ත සූත්‍රය මගින් බුදුන් වහන්සේ පෙන්වා දී තිබෙනවා.
22nd Amendment to the Constitution Bill stalled.
විසිටෙවැනි විවස්ථා සාසනයේ අද ගෙටන්න
අපි මේකට විවාදයට ගත වෙන කාල වේලාව අනුව ඒක තීන්දුව කරන්න පුළුවන්.
කිරියල්ල මැතිතුමා පස්වරුවේ හමු වුණු අවස්ථාව අනුව සහයෝගය දක්වන්නට අමාරු බව ප්‍රකාශ වුණා. බොහොම කනගාටුයි.
කරුණා කරලා මෙතන පෙන්වන්න හදන්න එපා. මේ විපක්ෂයේ විරුද්ධ වුණ නිසා මේක ගැන ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙනවා කියන කාරණාව.
Professor Ranjit Bandara appointed co-chairman.
තාමත් අර කපුටු කාගේ න්‍යාය පත්‍රයට තමයි මේ කාර්යක සභාපති වෙන්නේ.
A trusted place for your fixed deposit. Valuable FD. 25% for 2 months. 25.5% for 4 months. Valuable FD. The symbol of stability.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation with the foreign policy analyst, Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke. Now then, Mr. Wijetilleke, earlier you mentioned when we were talking about the UN and the vote against Sri Lanka today, and you also mentioned how much this is dominated by the West. But I also want to say this, and they, as in the West and the UN, they talk almost eloquently about Sri Lanka's lack of human rights and the accountability of that. But I'd also like to say this, that Liz Truss, their new Prime Minister in Britain, she declared herself to be a Zionist. And really, you don't need to declare yourself as a Zionist if you don't care about the people and the human rights of the people in a place that used to be called Palestine, which is now Israel. I just thought I'd point that out too, because the people of Palestine also have human rights, as indeed everyone else on this planet has human rights. And it's just not limited to tiny Sri Lanka, where they feel that they can just bully us through, because quite wrongly the ruling politicians in this country have only paid lip service to human rights and the accountability process here. And as for that 95% that Minister Ali Sabri mentioned about the release of the lands. I'd really like him to provide us with details of the 95%, and he must take into account all the land that was taken away, and it's no good just minusing out the bits that are kept back for security reasons. I just thought I'd mention that. Now then, you know, while all this business is going on, this juggling and horse trading and so on and so forth at government, our government, the team today, they found this person, I call him the broom maker, due to some freak accident. He ended up, he made brooms, you know, the eco brooms and so on, and that's how he made his living. But a freak accident, and he ended up paralyzed. But this versatile, resilient Sri Lankan from the Kalutara district, he didn't just give up on life. He continues to make them, but he is actually pulling himself around because he can't walk anymore. But he's got his hands, and that's not stopping him. So, you know, it's heartbreaking to think of what happened to him, but he didn't let that stop him, and that's the spirit. I just thought I'd let you know, because not everyone sees, I'm sure you'll be able to see on the news and so on, but it's terribly unfair for the people of this country when they can't afford the price. It's all very good talking about, oh, you know, the interest rates have to go up and we need to control inflation and all that. Do you know what? The people out there, they're not into this thing. All they know is that the milk powder is so expensive if you can get it. Food, they can't afford 3 square meals a day. The children, we're being terribly unfair, the government is, because with the undernourishment and the malnutrition, those and the pregnant women and so on, these effects won't be felt for another 2 to 3 years' time. There'll be stunted growth, there'll be reduced IQ levels, and so Sri Lanka will suffer many years later, long after these old fossils in Parliament have dead and gone.
Yeah, it's a pretty depressing situation for us, and actually when you think about the perception that Sri Lanka, I mean, on one side we're trying to build this image of a tourism hub, on the other side we're trying to be a transport, a transshipment hub. But there's people literally that are skipping meals in our country. So I really think the priorities now need to shift a little bit. I mean, have we seen any of these targeted cash transfers that much of the intelligentsia have spoken about? I don't see any of that really happening. The funds that were given out to some 10,000 families, that also came, I believe, from the World Food Programme. So where are these reforms, and how are they going to help the poor? Because at the end of the day, the IMF have told us, protect the most vulnerable and the poor. All we're doing is saying, okay, we have to reform, and a few people, a few thousand people in some districts will have to starve. I don't think that's really how you're supposed to carry out reform. And I think if we keep ignoring what the IMF, the World Bank, the ADB, they've all been telling us, maybe for the better part of 5 years, that we need to collect more taxes, that we don't have. It's not even Sri Lanka, the region as a whole. Tax mobilization has been a problem. There are reports out by the ADB
but these so-called competent people who manage to, in essence, hoodwink the public, because they got the vote. And when they got in there, the first thing they did is they cut the taxes.
Yeah. And
it cost them something like 600 billion. For heaven's sake, at least when COVID came along, they ought to have reversed it, done a U-turn, like the Chancellor of the Exchequer did in Britain.
Yeah,
now, I want to just mention this to you, as somebody has quite rightly pointed out. It's about Churchill. Winston Churchill came forward when the British had a crisis. So said our now President, at the time Prime Minister. He had a plan, he implemented the plan as the people believed that plan. Our Churchill tries to recreate history and says that he came in for the crisis rather like Churchill. The only real difference, of course, is that the original Churchill had a plan. The Churchill duplicate has no plan, Because if he had a plan, the children won't be fainting. The children will always have their lunch prepared by their homes and bring it to school. This time round they have to depend on the humanitarian teachers and others who are helping to feed these kids. Kusum, tell me, is this called resolving the crisis?
It's clearly not, Faraz, but just on your Churchill anecdote, the president, I think, sort of thinks of himself as a Churchillian character. We've seen that. It seems pretty clear. He's mentioned specifically, he referenced the War Ministry that was formed by Churchill and Attlee and Chamberlain. Now, what he perhaps thinks of himself, and even I think you mentioned that Churchill brought himself forward. No, Churchill was the candidate of both sides of the aisle at that time. That's not something we can say about Mr. Wickremesinghe. Mr. Wickremesinghe has support on one side of the aisle. He has zero support on the other. And in fact,
as evidenced by the voting records.
And in fact, the War Ministry that he referred to, that Mr. Wickremesinghe referred to a few months ago, that was in the form of a leadership council. I don't see Mr. Wickremesinghe bringing in a leadership council. If anything, he's the finance minister as well as the most powerful president in our country's history. So I don't think he's really looking for advice, and he doesn't seem to have suggested that by his moves. He hasn't brought in some professional economist to say, advise me on this. No, we are still going with most of his failed...
But it's clear that this government can't form the national government that our president wants to. So isn't it back to basics? And that basic means that it's time to have elections.
Yes, in fact, the outgoing High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, in her report where she left, she mentioned that there's been a notable hardening of approach with increasing public rhetoric characterizing protesters as violent extremists. And she notes how there's a gap in between that rhetoric and what the ground reality is and how people feel on the ground. So she tacitly endorses the call for an early election. I quote, it remains a significant deficit in confidence and trust between the government, the protest movement, and a civil society, and calls have continued for early elections for a renewed democratic mandate. So even the UNHRC can see that there's a gap between what the people want, what the people feel, and what the government is prepared to do. So there really is no other way than going for an election at the earliest possible point so we can get a fresh mandate and have some leaders who have a mandate from the people to reform. Otherwise, reform is happening in a top-down manner. And we've seen throughout history, just in the 21st century, that reforms, when they are basically shoved down someone's throat, they're not going to be taken up so well. And then you're going to have more economic strife.
And so a lot of people will say, right, so we'll have elections. Does that mean that magically all the prices will come down? The foreign exchange reserves will magically also go up, and the expatriate workers will send us back the money, forgetting the 50 rupee premium they can make per dollar? Is that what's going to happen?
Well, for any of our economic policies, for them to succeed, there has to be trust between the government and the people. Right? If you're going to bring out a policy, the people have to trust in that policy. I don't see that trust being built. If you don't have a foundation of trust between the people and the government, I don't see how you can rush through. Especially, we are rushing through reforms. We are bringing some of the hardest, most painful reforms ever seen in the history of our country, and it's being done by, with all due respect to the president, a politician that does not have a popular mandate. It's been led by a parliament that has lost its popular mandate. It's quite evident.
We need elections.
I think there's no other way to say it.
You know, the more and more I think about it, and just as we're coming to the end of this program, because Harsha's having a fit there on the other side in the control room, but the more and more I think about this thing, it is obvious that for the forgotten people of Sri Lanka, there is only one silver lining in a very, very, very dark sky, and that is the Gammadda movement. Because when the Gammadda movement, when the boys and girls from Gammadda turn up at these villages and so on, the people there know that they will be heard. they're listening, along with the boys and girls from the Peradeniya University, they're listening to the people's distress, specifically what it is, 1, 2, 3, whatever. And they know that come sometime later, there will be real relief provided by that team, the government, the movement. So, Kusum Wijetilleke, so I'm so sorry. Thank you for being on the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Faraz. Appreciate it very much.
And it's amazing that Sri Lanka's giving Sri Lanka's giving is helping to feed these children out there in the Kalkutta district. And let's hear tomorrow from people from our movement in Jaffna and in Martale too. On that note, take care, have a great evening, and God bless you all.